Chris Bogg!
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Very subtle fade there. Very subtle fade. Hello, everyone.
It says Jimmy Fairhurst, but I'm not Jimmy Fairhurst. I'm Laura Harrison, everyone.
You look different. Have you done something with your hair,
You
Jimmy?
look great, Jimmy. You look better. That's the best you've ever looked, Jimmy.
How are we doing? Margaret, Michelle, Sarah, how are we doing?
Not bad.
Good, all right.
Good.
Well, it's the time of Chris Bogg, sound, lighting extraordinaire from Warrington. So, Chris, I'm just going to hand it straight over to you.
Fantastic. Morning, everybody. Big thanks for joining us and logging in this morning and listen to me waffle on, hopefully not too much. Please dive straight in if you've got any questions rather than wait until the end, because I don't do a lot of public speaking, so I want to keep it as informal as possible. I learned really early on that the right side of the proscenium for me is not on stage. So yeah, do dive straight in. I'm a Warrington lad, born and bred. Like Laura said, I grew up in Sankey, and I started getting into sound and lighting at high school. I went to Great Sankey High, and I was really fortunate that they had, when I was in year 7, they opened a new theatre there, and they were really keen to get kids involved in doing sound and lighting, I guess like most schools, because the teachers didn't know how to do it, and they thought it would be better just to get the kids to learn. So they started a technical theatre club after school, which I think was brilliant. And I'm a big sort of advocate and a big believer of like trying to get kids into sound and lighting at that age. So I still do a little bit in schools, and sort of going around helping them a little bit, because I think had things had been different, and that wasn't available to me, I might have taken a different path completely. When I first went to year 7, I did a little bit of acting like everyone does in a school production, and realised very quickly that wasn't for me. I'm a musician, so I play drums, so it was great to have another alternative outlet to start looking at sound and still be involved in the music side of things, but not be on stage. So I've got my drama teacher, Miss Morris, to thank for getting me initially into sound and lighting, and sort of showing me the basics really. While I was at school, I was really lucky that my cousin was an accountant for a company called the Mean Fiddler, which is now Festival Republic. So they do a lot of the big festivals across the country. And so as she was paying one of the lighting suppliers a large sum of money, she was like, oh, my cousin's 15 and he likes doing lights, and can you offer him some work experience? And this guy reluctantly agreed. So I rocked up to Reading Festival without knowing anything about it really, just got me a pass and said, turn up and ring this number. And I came down to Reading Festival and did like 4 or 5 days working with the lighting crew there. And that was such an eye-opener at 15 to be like sleeping on a tour bus with a load of rock and roll lighting techs. But I learned an awful lot very quickly about how it worked. So sort of armed with like my experience at school and a summer of working for festivals with this company, Art of Darkness, they were called. And it was run by a guy called Brian Leach, who was a fantastic lighting designer. He died a couple of years back, but he used to do like Manic Street Preachers, all of the big arena tours. And so armed with that experience, I got into college and studied technical theatre at West Cheshire College over in Ellesmere Port. Went on from that to get a place at LIPA, which was fantastic. So I did a 3-year degree at LIPA in theatre and performance design and technology. So it was sound, lighting, stage management, fly in, little bit of costumes, little bit of set, and then you got to specialise in what you wanted to do. And it was there really, up until that point, I'd mostly done lighting and a little bit of sound, but it was there that I started to sort of really take an interest in more in the sound side of things. And that was predominantly due to the fact that the lecturer there, a guy called Chris Layton, was only recently new to lecturing. He was like a monitor engineer, so he looked after the sound for artists on stage with a separate sound desk at the side of the stage, rather than mixing the sound for the audience. So he was a monitor engineer for massive acts like Afro Celt Sound System, and used to spend his summers like touring the world, and decided he was going to go into teaching. And he just had the right personality to be a fantastic lecturer and really engaged people. And so I kind of decided I was going to pursue sound more than lighting from that point almost. Throughout my time at college and my degree, I was working at the Par Hall, where I met Seb. And another little sound and lighting company in Warrington who's still going, called Axe. And it was people like Brian Leach at Art of Darkness, or Martin from Axe and the Par Hall, that offered me opportunities to expand more on learning outside of college and university, which I think is so important, to be able to make the mistakes at college and uni, but learn very quickly outside of an educational environment. So I'd encourage anyone that's in education to be pursuing as much as you can outside of education as well. It taught me not only about the kit, but about how to conduct yourself in our industry, really, how to take bookings for work, not letting people down, negotiating a fee for your work. And so I'd always done that whilst training. And I'd also built up a little bit of a stock of equipment myself. Bits that I couldn't hire in locally, or bits that I just wanted to own. So whilst I was freelancing, I was also DJing for parties, weddings, and I got into mixing for like covers bands and wedding bands, and then DJing in between, so I could offer like the whole service, and it meant the band's got a better PA system. And I kind of built all of this up, and stored it in my dad's garage while I was living at home. I've got my mum and dad really to thank for everything starting the company, really. They were so supportive in terms of letting me load up their estate car, and my dad would drive it round and drop all the kit off, and later helping me buy my first van. Even before I could drive, I'd bought a van and my dad was driving it around for me. So following Lipper, I was going to move out of my mum and dad's house, and sort of look to move into a house with my girlfriend, who I'd met, who was a performer at the time, and we'd met on the Par Hall Panto. Seb, I don't know whether you remember Sarah. So I was lighting, designing the Panto, and she was in the cast. So looking at it, although I was already freelancing for several different companies, I kind of took the step to get a grown-up job, a full-time position that was a bit less risky. And I remember having interviews for Liverpool Empire, at Chester Gateway when that was still open, and a venue that I'd not even heard of in Manchester called the Bridgewater Hall. And it wasn't even really on my radar because it was a concert hall, not a theatre. But I got the job at the Bridgewater Hall, and I looked after their sound department for about 2.5 years. And an awful lot of the work that went into there was big orchestral concerts, some of them amplified and some of them not. Or big American touring artists who didn't want to do an arena, they wanted an intimate space. It's about 2,000 seats, so not that intimate, but that looked nicer than the Apollo. Basically, that was the kind of the artists you would get. So I was really fortunate to do some work with James Brown, Tony Bennett, Nightmares on Wax, even Will Young toured through there. So it was a great experience working in a huge venue straight out of university, really. And I love the challenge of working in a really acoustically challenging environment. So concert halls like the Bridgewater are designed so that you can hear a pin drop or a singer whisper on stage in every seat in the venue. But that's actually really difficult to install and look after a PA system in a venue like that. It's a bit of a common misconception. People go, oh, concert halls have got fantastic acoustics, and they have if you're not amplifying anything, and it's and the noise is coming from the stage. But if you're going to put a speaker system in there, it's about as challenging as it can get in terms of the reverb, and what you end up with is hearing it but not understanding the words. So there's no more challenging environment to put a speaker system into, and I really enjoyed the challenge of delivering sometimes even corporate stuff where it was mostly speech to 2,000 people in like a really difficult to hear space. I learned a lot about my craft in those 2.5 years, really. Again, sort of fresh out of university. I learned how to work with other people and how to get the best out of them. What all of the musical instruments in an orchestra sound like, which is important if you're looking to amplify them and blend them together. How to work with orchestras who are incredibly meticulous and sometimes just damn right fussy about everything, basically. And so how to get on the right side of them, and how to work with them to get the best out of them when they might not be up for being amplified. That's one of the big things. So they're all up for traditional orchestra concerts, but the second you do something with a soprano or a tenor that needs mic-in, and then we put the mics over the orchestra, they all get very funny about it. So yeah, learning how to work with different types of musicians. I learned a lot there about the work I like to do as well, and the fact that previous to working at the Bridgewater, I hadn't realised how much I liked the variety of work that I was doing, working for different companies, doing different things each day. And so by the time I got to working at the Bridgewater Hall for about 2 years, I was involved in the commissioning of a new sound system, which made the job infinitely easier. And a lot of the tours were coming round again the following year. And I just found that I was working every day off that I had at other venues, trying to do something different, and I'd run out. It was running out of time, so I decided to leave. I had a fantastic technical manager there, a girl called Miriam Stone, who my one-to-ones with Miriam were much more about what my life plans were than how that job was particularly going, which I think is something all bosses could kind of take away with them, really, is that it's not just about what you want to learn and how you can benefit that job, but what do you want to do in the future and how does this fit in. And so she wasn't surprised at all when I handed my notice in and said I was setting up a hire company myself. So in the years that followed that, I worked freelance for a couple of other companies while my company established and grew. I was still working out of my dad's garage, but I very quickly outgrew that with the amount of equipment. I outgrew my mum's friend's garage, and before long we'd moved into a unit in Woolston. And those little jobs that were covers bands for weddings had turned into 2-week tours, 3-week tours, etc. And everything was just growing, really. I worked on all sorts of events. Again, the variety was really key to kind of keeping me happy in my work. So we did theatre, we did a lot of amateur theatre, music festivals, crazy outdoor events such as, like, it doesn't happen now, but Liverpool Lantern Parade, where they used to parade a big load of lit structures through Sefton Park, and then there was a big fireworks display or like fire display that we provided the sound system for, and sometimes that was up to 10,000, 15,000 people, which was fantastic. I met some fantastic friends both at university and through work that are still lifelong connections, really. Some of them still work for the company now, or we're just friends, and they've kind of moved down to London or elsewhere in the country. It was at this stage that sort of the next chapter of my work began, really, because although I run DBS Solutions as a hire company, I'm also now a sound designer and work on lots of musical theatre, some plays, and I kind of got into sound design a little bit backwards to a lot of other people. Up until that point, I'd been designing sound and lighting systems, but I hadn't really thought of them as design as a separate thing. It was always just so that I could quote for the job, get the client a price and deliver it. It had to be designed. We had to decide what speakers were going where, what cable was needed, etc. And it was all just part of one big job to rent the kit out and do the work. But like I say, I kind of came at it backwards a little bit to other sound designers. The way most sound designers have kind of got into theatre is that they'll usually become a sound operator, maybe in a producing theatre, and they'll work their way up. They'll find a designer that likes to work with them, and that designer will take them maybe on tour or into the West End, and they'll work their way up to being like mixing, what we call number one sound operator, which is like the head of the sound department. And they'll be mixing the show, and then they might become an associate designer, which usually happens when that tour goes back out again and they've got a new operator, and they might say, well, you mixed it last time, you know what it needs to sound like, the designer's really busy, come and associate design this for me and you can look after it. And then after a few of those, they might get some of their own work in, either in producing houses as a designer or in commercial theatre. And that's not at all what happened to me. So I back in 2013, we were hiring some radio mics to a couple of LIPA students who'd set up a theatre company in the final year at uni. And they carried on this theatre company after they left. And although they weren't at LIPA when I was there, the network of graduates is quite close. And so that had brought us together, and we rented them some microphones and give them some advice. And they went to do a tour around, like a couple of dates tour of Susical the Musical. It was a company called Celador Theatre Company. And the tour went well, and then following year, they looked to remount it. And they contacted me to say it was going into the West End. So I say it's the West End. It's a little venue called the Arts Theatre. And for those of you that don't know it, it's a couple of hundred seats. It's not much bigger than a studio theatre, but with a proscenium. But it has the right postcode to say that it's a West End show. So all the small stuff goes in there. So we chatted about the show, and I just kind of said, do you need a sound designer? And I don't think at the time the two lads from Celador really knew what a sound designer was, but they knew that they wanted the show to sound better than last time it had gone out. And they had a very inexperienced sound operator that they wanted someone to help with and to make some of the decisions. So they said yes. And so this was my real first sound design as a professional gig that was paid for the design, and not just the kit and put it together, please. And it was also a West End show, and it's still to date my only West End credit. But it went well, and people said nice things about it and the way it sounded. And one of the directors of Celador asked if he could take me out for dinner before one night of the show. And it's the one time a theatre producer has ever asked to take me out to dinner. And I now know that that's only something that a theatre producer does if they want you to do something for them. So he told me about a production that they were mounting called Avenue Q. And they were mounting it for 3 weeks at Greenwich. And then they were trying to get it into a couple of other venues for a week or two here or there. So it was looking like 5 or 6 weeks. And a couple of years before that, I'd been into the West End and seen Avenue Q and loved it and thought it was hilarious. So I was really keen to do the show. Like I say, it was 5 or 6 weeks. They would, it was 3 weeks guaranteed at Greenwich plus a bit. And they offered me a fee, which was pretty low, but it was similar to everybody else on the show. And I kind of just agreed and said, yeah, that's great. And I was sounding it, before long I was sound designing another musical with no contract, no agent, just an agreement between friends. And in the end, all told, that show toured for 6 months in 2014 and kind of established me as a sort of sound designer and helped me get an agent. Since then, it's toured 3 more times around the UK, sometimes for a year at a time. It's done shows in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and even on a cruise ship. So yeah, all just because I said yes without really knowing what was involved. And this opened the door for me with other producers, and I've since toured musicals like Spamalot, Legally Blonde, plays like End of the Rainbow. But it isn't until you get that first touring credit that other people are interested in taking you seriously. So after the first tour of Avenue Q, I joined an organisation called the Association of Sound Designers, which is a little bit like our version of Equity or our version of Beck 2. And although they're not They're not a union. They're just an association that helps advise people. It's about the only resource for talking to other sound designers. I always find it funny because as a sound designer or as a lighting designer, there's only one of you on a show. So I don't have that many friends that are sound designers. I've got lots of friends that I've worked with that are lighting designers or directors or choreographers or set designers. But I don't have that many sound designer friends because you don't work with other sound designers. So it was nice to be able to talk to them and get involved in an association that, you know, you could ask questions. And I spoke to the chairman of the ASD at the time, and he's a designer called Gareth Owen. And for those of you that haven't heard of Gareth Owen, he's grown his business, Gareth Owen Sound, to be, if anyone's heard of one sound designer, it's probably going to be Gareth. He's grown his business as a brand, and he's designed shows like Come From Away and Juliet, Back to the Future, Bat Out of Hell. So I had some questions for him about how he works when a tour then looks to go and stay in a venue for a couple of weeks and they want you to revisit it, how renegotiating fees, etc. And he just came back to me and said, it sounds like you need an agent. I don't deal with any of that anymore, and I wouldn't know where to start. So I went and got an agent for my sound design work and separated it out a little bit from the rental work from DBS. And that wasn't as easy as I thought it might be, finding an agent that would take on a new creative that might need some developing, but also who's working like part-time, running his own company and doing other things. They weren't particularly interested. So it was a bit of a hard sell for an agent. But I found one that would look after my contracts and kind of negotiate all of that sort of stuff, which was great because he had much more experience of that than I did. And he was far too busy to help me develop my kind of talent as a creative, but for the time being that was fine, and it was still the best thing that I'd done. And I later left that agency and went to a smaller agency who I'm still with now, who was able to sort of help me a lot more and had a lot more time to work with me. But during this time that I'd been sound designing several different musicals and stuff, I'd fallen into favour with an orchestra promoter that I'd done a lot of work with back at the Bridgewater Hall, a company called Raymond Gubby, and they produced all sorts of concerts, anything from traditional orchestra concerts that didn't need any help from a sound and lighting perspective to candlelit concerts. They now do shows like Hans Zimmer versus John Williams, Space Spectacular, where they play all of the space kind of theme classics. And I'd done a lot of lighting for them over the years at the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester, and little bits of sound. And they came to me to say, look, we're moving a show called Classical Spectacular, which is an enormous project at the Royal Albert Hall that they do in London. And it has hundreds and hundreds of moving lights. And it's lit by a guy called Durham Merengue, who lights the Olympic opening ceremonies. Basically, it's the biggest project anyone could ever look at, and it has thousands of lighting cues and 6 days to program in London. And they basically said, we're going to do the show in Manchester on a much, 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 much smaller budget. Would you be interested in providing some lighting and lighting it for us? And they brought down the cue list and all the scores from London, and I had a look through and said yes. And this was the first time now that I was working for this massive orchestra promoter, but directly for their London office rather than just the guy that looks after Manchester. And that was a real key turning point in the type of work that I was able to take on. The London bosses came over to watch the show, and I remember the managing director saying, for the time that I'd been able to put in and that they paid for, he was amazed at the result. It was nothing like Classical Spectacular in London, but it was great for the time I'd put in. And sort of 8 or 9 years on now, they're our biggest client by some way. So between all of this and the UK tours and lighting the orchestra concerts, this had allowed me to kind of create connections with some of the regional theatres in the country. So I was really fortunate to do some great shows for the Mercury Theatre in Colchester, the Belgrade Theatre, Story House, and Theatre Clwyd. and I wasn't really able to get into the sort of super creative environments that the producing houses create, as opposed to more of a commercial environment, which was great. The budgets were often tighter, but the staff were always great. There was a real willingness to make the show happen, and a kind of glass half full team player attitude that I just didn't find in commercial theatre. There was always obstacles in commercial theatre, usually money, but sometimes just time too. So it's a funny story, but I find that so much of my work comes from other creatives. Like I was saying previously, other creatives that you've worked with, like set designers or lighting designers, suggesting me to other directors or to producers. So I was called in to design a Bollywood musical, which was a co-production with the Belgrade Theatre and a company called Physical Theatre. And it was sort of like Grease or High School Musical meets a Bollywood production. So it didn't take itself too seriously. And a set designer I'd worked with before was already involved and suggested me. And although it wasn't something I'd experienced with at all, I took it, and the tour went really well. And I've since designed a few shows for the Belgrade. So that's how I've always, when I look back at how I've got into venues, it's always been through working with somebody else on the show who's suggested me. So I think that's the key really, is get out and get networking, and make sure you're nice to everybody, not just the people that are paying your wages. I did the Bollywood tour. I remember the sound on this musical being slightly forgotten in the budget. And when they first contacted me, the production manager was really having to try and carve a hole for any kind of sound I ever told. It had been completely missed off the radar, which was weird for a musical. So I remember arriving on the first day, having dealt with this tiny sort of budget that they'd found and touring a very, very limited amount of kit. So I arrived with our tiny little van and unloaded the sound kit, and then saw this huge truck, like a 40-foot truck of lighting equipment arriving. And I remember thinking to myself, I really must ask more questions about the way the budget is divvied up, because sound has definitely been shortchanged a little bit. But the producers learned that I could deliver a show with tiny amounts of kit and a tiny budget, and that was all really helpful for the next project. I really enjoyed working in producing theatres, and I think that's where people can be the most creative sometimes. But with my foot in both camps as a sound designer and also somebody who rents equipment out for a living, the producing houses are often very well equipped, and their shows are produced for a much shorter amount of time. So sometimes the kind of business model with the rental company doesn't always allow me to take those shows on. I also learned that being away from the office and the business, and with us having such a small team at DBS, sometimes things can suffer a little bit if there's someone not at the helm constantly steering the ship. So it's often a really hard balance for me as to whether I take a project on. It's often really difficult to balance depending on whether there's a significant rental on there. So I often end up doing longer tours or turning things down if I'm becoming too busy. So the last few years, not deliberately, but theatre has taken a little bit of a back seat as the orchestra work and like concerts work has picked up. I love doing theatre a lot, and like I say, it's where I'm most creative and most happy, but the rental rates for equipment in theatre are truly terrible when you look at the return on investment for buying a piece of equipment. And that's not the case in concert touring or corporate events. So it's all very much a fine balance. And I think if I found I was just doing theatre, I'd never be able to buy new toys or to spec new equipment on events, because it just wouldn't pay for itself. So that's one of the things that I've realised as the company's growing, is that there needs to be more of a balance of the type of work that we take on, just to be able to pay everybody's salaries. So as I'm approaching 40 this year, I think the last few years, and certainly over the pandemic, has made us all value friends and family a little bit more. And although events and concerts are returning now with a vengeance, and we seem to be busier as a company and me personally than we've ever been now. I have to admit, I'm starting to feel a little bit like being a little bit selective about the projects that I take on is certainly going to help and allow me to dedicate more time to getting those right too. It certainly wouldn't be fair to name the shows that I've worked on but in the past I have taken shows on because I've had a gap or the money is good, and I think now I've realised that there needs to be much more than that. I either need to really want to work with some of the team, some of the creatives on that show, or really want to work with the venue and really like the show and feel passionate about it to be able to do a good job. I've realised that hopping from hotel to hotel and being away from home and away from my family is hard enough, even when you really want to do it, but it's almost impossible to remain enthusiastic when it's a show that you're not that enthusiastic about. And there hasn't been that many of them, but there's been one or two, and I've kind of realised that I need to learn to say no. During the pandemic, over the last 18 months, I've had to really think outside of the box to keep DBS Solutions moving and keep employing the people that we do. And for years now, we've been providing audio systems for illuminated trails over the Christmas period, like in stately homes such as Blenheim Palace, Belton House. And these are typically consist of about 70 or 100 speakers hidden amongst bushes and trees around the gardens, playing Christmas music in separate little zones or effects when people walk past. And when COVID hit and all of the normal Christmas shows in theatres and pantomimes started pulling the plug, I realised I had to get out and find much more work in the lit trail sector to be able to keep going. So I really found that my sound and lighting design past working in theatre really helped me to create some clever installations that I could pitch to the organisers of these lit trails, and ultimately kept the company busy through last winter. So we designed some installations that were like big pads that you could jump on, and they play sounds and bits of trees or woods and light up. And that was something fairly unique to these lit trails and something that they really liked. And so that kept us busy last winter. We've got a lot more of that this winter too, which is good. So I did everything from programming interactive displays that light up, LED walkways that you walk through with like little LED pixels either side of you, all sorts of stuff, recording dialogue of Santa's elves to play back, all that kind of sort of slightly quirky stuff. But I think that if you're able to think and practice creatively, you can find places to do that I never even knew existed, prior to the pandemic. And I've also learned that there's a real market for that, for creative theatrical thinking outside of a theatrical environment. So that's definitely something I'm going to kind of take forward, working slightly differently and outside of theatre. One thing I really love about the work that I do is the variety. One day I could be designing a sound system for a UK tour, or the next day I could be installing lighting in a high school, or testing out outdoor speakers that I've put in my freezer overnight for a Christmas trail just to check they work at -2 degrees or -3 degrees. So every day is really different. And the pandemic made me look at what transferable skills I've got. I'm sure that's the case for everybody. And whether I wanted to work in this industry and do this forever. And I have to admit, it's quite scary. I often hear within our industry that if the track and trace system had been given to a production manager, it'd have been done in a week, and there'd have been no problems with it. And I think that's probably true. The arena touring side of the entertainment industry moves stages, all of the sound and lighting and production, costume, wardrobe, catering, even massage therapy and doctors. they move that from one town to the next every day, and it gets installed at 6 o'clock in the morning and taken out at 1 o'clock in the morning and driven to the next town seamlessly with no problems. And I think the skills in our industry are so vast and incredible, and yet they often seem to be worth so little outside of our industry. And I think there's so many of us in the entertainment industry that are like our industry's best kept secret. And at least for now, I'm happy with that. I've got so many friends returning to work over the last couple of months, and it's great to see the look and the smile on their faces when on their first show back after delivering food for Tesco or fixing bikes at Halfords. It's a fantastic feeling to be back doing what you love. So it's made me realise just how much I enjoy working in our industry, really. So that's great. That's it for me, really. But if you've got any questions, fire away.
Thank you, Chris. That was amazing. That was really, really good. I've wrote down a few questions. Has anybody else got any first, though? Let me just check. Let me take you off spotlight now. We're all chatting.
Right.
Have I done that? Have I taken you off spotlight?
Yeah, you're on now.
Yeah. So has anyone got any questions, or shall I go? Anyone? I'll go first then, Chris. Chris, just for our people that'll watch this afterwards, like students and stuff like that. Back to your theatre shows where you mentioned you move through work your way up from sound number 2, sound number 1, blah blah blah. Yeah. Can you just take us through in a simple way what would the responsibilities would be of a sound number 2 versus a sound number 1, and also on any one show, how many sound technicians would you say would be part of it? Does it depend on the show size? Just so the people that are watching it can understand that kind of.
Yeah, sure. So usually on a small, on a kind of mid-scale tour, basically. So the smaller end of the Kenwright stuff, the cellar door stuff, and to be honest, there's a lot more shows at that level now than there ever has been. The last couple of years, 5, 6, 7 years ago, there'd only really have been number 1 touring shows. Things like Saigon or Les Mis would have come to Manchester for 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, and they'd have had a touring team of 3 sound engineers. They might have had what we call production sound engineers, which are sound engineers that just install the show in a new venue. And that might have taken, it's unbelievable to think really, sort of 10 years ago, that might have taken a week to install in Manchester Palace. And that'd have been a week's work for 3, maybe 4 production engineers. And then they'd all disappear, and the team of 3 sound engineers would stay and mix the show for 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. And then it'd move to another town. And so a tour used to be a couple of years, but might visit 6 or 7 towns. And now, as you know, Laura, you're lucky if it moves every 2 weeks. More often than not, it moves every week. And sometimes it moves every week and opens on a Monday, closes on a Saturday and opens on a Monday. The first tour of Avenue Q that I did what we call split weeks. Have you ever done a tour that does split weeks, Laura?
No, I don't think I have.
It's horrible. Opening on a Monday, closing on a Wednesday, moving to a different venue, opening on a Thursday, closing on a Saturday, moving and a day off on Sunday. It is horrendous. And it didn't do that every week because people would probably keel over. But it definitely did some split weeks. I don't think there's any theatre tours of that size doing split weeks now, really. But so that kind of mid-scale, things have changed a lot now, and that trying to make theatre affordable is a big thing. I know it's a big thing for Kenwrights. It's definitely one of Celador's remits to make theatre ticket prices affordable. So in doing so, it's moving every week. It's moving with a smaller team. And the Celador shows didn't have production engineers at all. So, and they'd usually have 2 sound technicians on it. Wow. And so the roles on a show like that, where there isn't a production engineer, are even more crucial. But on a big show, let's take a bigger Kenwright show that might have 2 engineers with production engineers to move it, or 3. The number 3 would usually be looking after radio mics on stage. So they could look after 20, maybe even 30 radio mics. Everything from tuning those and making sure they work in the town that you're going to this week, and make sure that they're licensed and that there's not interference that's going to cause problems. Looking after them, clipping them onto the cast, making sure they're in the right place, which is really important to be regimented and consistent. Making sure that the batteries are changed, making sure that faults are fixed with them. The number 3 will also usually look after things in the pit, in the orchestra pit with the band. That's something that the number 2 and number 3 share. So if there's a number 3, it's usually if there's 3 staff on the show, sometimes the show needs three staff, and it's what we'd call a 3 plot show. Or it might be that the show only has 2 plots, and that's kind of like, a plot is effectively like a list of jobs that need doing during the show. So if you're on the stage plot, you might be looking after the radio mics, and you might also be running down to the pit to look after things. If there's a number 3, then and it's a 3-show plot, then there might be somebody on stage looking after the radio mics. There might be somebody else that looks after, if there's kids in the show, there might be an extra person that looks after the radio mics for the kids and the band. But more often than not on a touring show, if there's a number 3, it's so that they can rotate days off. Mm-hmm. Because if there's a 2-man team or a 2-woman team, then you usually have to rely on what's called a tech swing. And it's a bit like a swing in the cast, really. It's a technician that does a bit of lights, a bit of sound, a bit of props and set, and they'll usually rotate everybody's days off or sit cover, etc. And interestingly, like, that's one of the jobs that a lot of people get straight out of college, because they've studied technical theatre and they've done a bit of it all. It's usually one of the lower paid jobs, but I think it's a really important job, because doing all of those things well is impossible.
It's like being a cover that covers all the parts. Like if you're not there, you can't. You do so much that you can't then step in so that person can have their day off, or if that person's sick. You actually went on to my next question about tech swing, because I was going to say, would you advise, like, for instance, students and stuff working towards this, that they get experience in other fields so they could be tech swing?
I think it depends what you want to do. So you could just purely pursue sound, and your first role out in professional theatre might be a sound number 3 or a sound number 2, or you could experience a bit of everything and your first role would be a tech swing. I think it's really interesting because people look at the tech swing role and give it to college graduates, but like we were just saying, then it's such an important role. You have to be able to do all of those jobs, and you have to be able to do them almost as well as the person that's supposed to be doing them. I mean, if you look at let's take the swing that we had on the swing in the cast that we had on Legally Blonde. Like, she was like a super swing. If she'd have been straight out of college, would she have been able to cover all those roles really well? Probably not. But people look at tech swing slightly differently, I think, which is a shame, because they look at it as the bottom rung. And I don't think it is, really. I think it shouldn't be. But that's a good place to start out, I think.
Yeah.
Or sound number 3 on a big show. Potentially sound number 3 on a big show is easier to get than sound number 2 on a show that doesn't have a 3, because as the team gets smaller, the responsibilities go and the pressure gets higher, particularly if there's not production sound engineers to move it. So what I find when I'm staffing a show is, if I can get a production sound engineer or 2, it takes the pressure off the skill set of the number 1 sound operator, and the number 2 sound operator can be much more refined to dealing with the cast and the politics, to mixing the show, and looking after. Essentially, the sound number 1 is a head of department. There might only be a department of 1 or 2, but they're level with the musical director. If there's a musical supervisor on the show, that's the equivalent of sound designer and lighting designer. But the musical director is essentially the head of the music department, and the sound designer, the sound number 1 is the head of the sound department. So it's a crucial role, and I think that shows sound better when they have a production sound engineer. There's no doubt about that, because they're the key link between a sound designer and what the sound designer wants it to sound like, and the practicality of installing this in a day, getting it to work in a different venue every week with different challenges. And I think finding a sound operator with that skill set and with the operating skill set and the attention to detail, who's also able to install the system, make those choices, is a really difficult find. And those people have snapped up. So when I design a mid-scale tour and I find one of those, like Kieran, who we had on Legally Blonde, the second he finishes that tour, he's going on to a bigger and a better tour, because he's learned so much about that skill set that he'll get snapped up, and he has, and that's completely, that's great for him. The same with Avenue Q, the same with Spamalot. Those mid-scale tours, once you've done one and you do it well, it's a really good stepping stone to step up. Yeah. Likewise, they're a great starting point for someone who's going to get a tech swing job. They're a great starting point for someone who's going to get a number 2 job. So much of the number 2, so much of all of our industry, but the sound number 1 and number 2 job is about people.
Yeah.
Particularly with the sound 2 job, you can be the most technical person, but if you're not good at people, you're going to fall at the first hurdle. And if you don't get the cast on side and they like you as a number 2, or as a radio mic person, regardless of number 2 or number 3, you're going to have an incredibly tough job. Yeah. Less so for the sound number 1. I think the sound number 1 can hide a little bit of front of house if that's what they want to do. I think it's good. All of these roles rotate. So usually the sound number 1 is predominantly mixing, and certainly is responsible for mixing, and usually responsible for teaching the sound number 2 how to mix the show. Mm-hmm. The balance between shows, if you've got an 8-show week, the sound number 1 will quite often mix 4 or 5. The sound number 2 will mix 1 or 2. And when they're mixing, once they know how to mix it, the sound number 1 will either be on a day off or they'll be on stage doing the radio mic plot. Because it's important for redundancy and people being put ill that everyone is able to do all of the jobs. Mm-hmm. On a large show, the sound number 3 might only get to mix 1 or 2 shows. And that's the way it traditionally works, because all the producers and all the creatives want the sound number 1 to mix the Friday night. They want the sound number 1 to mix the Saturday night and the Saturday matinee, which means they never get those days off. And I think it's a difficult balance. I was talking to another great Warrington guy who we should get on this, a guy called Andy Waddell, who grew up with me mixing amateur theatre for Centenary and Cody's and all of that sort of stuff. And he was saying that, like, he's now gone on to mix Wicked. He's now mixing Frozen in town. He's done a lot, but he started as a number 2 for Ken Wright shows, and someone gave him a chance, and he proved himself. The balance of the number of shows that people mix is wrong, because the number 1's got the most experience, yet he gets 4 goes at it every week. The number 3, who's fresh out of college, who hasn't mixed a show at that level before, has to retain all the information between Tuesday night show and next Tuesday night show. And actually that should be, if we're encouraging people, that should be the wrong way, the other way around. But I think that's a difficult call when people are paying a lot of money for tickets.
Yeah. Seb, got a question?
Hi Chris, thanks for that. I don't think anybody watching this that is like purely performance will get over like what goes on outside of our little bubble sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think you've explained that really well. It's also really good to see that your passion for what you do hasn't waned in 20 odd years since we first met. That's good. But just a quick question, like you mentioned early on, like when you started, that you had Miss Morris, Brian Leach, your parents obviously supported you as well.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, if there's anyone watching this that shares your passion and would be as good maybe as you doing this job now, but doesn't have that support early on, and particularly I know Jimmy's passionate about working class people, that it's a big dream for them to even go and watch a show in a theatre, let alone go and work in one.
Yeah.
What advice you might give to those other Chris Boggs who maybe don't have that support that you got in the early days?
Yeah, I think do as much as you can outside of, if you're not going to get that support, if you're not in a position where your school are encouraging you to get involved technically, then get involved in in codies, get involved in centenary, get involved in amateur theatre, because you can make so many, you can learn so much, and make some mistakes too in a less pressured environment. And actually, the steps, once you get to like amateur theatre at a fairly serious level, it's very similar, really. You know, you can learn an awful lot. I mean, myself and Andy both learned our craft, like working in those organisations, really, as much as we did, you know, in training or elsewhere. But also get in touch, you know, get involved in Not Too Tame, and you know, we can link as DBS, we can link up with people and we can get people involved. With a little bit of work experience, or come into shows or come into gigs, and learning a bit more about it, because I think it's so important that, like you say, that you're able to get that experience. Another thing that I didn't mention there was, like, my mum and dad used to take me to shows at the Opera House and the Palace, and it was always amazing to see, like, I remember the first show, Avenue Q, that I took there, and I sat there on opening night going, I used to sit here watching, like, I used to come here for my birthday to watch Cats, you know, or Phantom, or and be pushy, and be. I remember reading in the back of the program for one of the shows. I looked down the stage manager list, in like the, you know, so get the program when you go to a show, and there's obviously all the show cast. There's like the camera crew for Cameron Macintosh, but there's also at the back, there's like the ATG crew. So get involved in, find who the stage manager is in Manchester Opera House or Manchester Palace, and go around to the stage door and ask, pester them, wait for them to come out. You know, who's the stage manager? All right, can you tell me when he comes out? Yeah, this is the guy, and grab him. Me and my mum waited at the stage door for the stage manager at the Opera House. At the time, he was a guy called Pat with big long dreads, and badgered him as he was walking to his car. I want to do some work experience. I want to come. And in the end, he just said, "Ring me next week." And this was after. This was after I went to watch Oliver with Russ Abbott and Gary Wilmot. They shared. It was in back when the show was there. I know, what a cast. So and they shared the role. So it was there for about 3 months. Like I say, that was when shows sat down in a venue for 3 months. So I went to watch it with Russ Abbott, and then we pestered this guy Pat. And he said, "All right, yeah, ring me next week and you can come in for some work experience." I must have been 14, on the train to the Opera House on my own, for a day, a Saturday. So there was a 2-show day, and that was later on in the run when Gary Wilmot was playing Fagin. And this Pat met me and just wanted to palm me off to some of the show crew, basically. So I spent the morning with the lighting department, and they were going through all of the lighting fixtures, checking the lighting, checking every fixture does what it's supposed to do, because the moving lights have got millions of complicated moving parts. So they run a routine that tests every function, and they might have to swap one if there's one that's broken. And then I sat with the lighting operator and watched the show and what they do. And then after the matinee show, the lighting guy kind of went, "What do you want to do now? You've sort of seen it all. Do you want to go with the sound department this evening and meet Johnny?" And this is another guy that Johnny Asher, his name was, and again he died a few years ago, but he was the most enthusiastic. Everyone in the industry knew Johnny Asher. He was a sound number one. He was larger than life. He was hilarious. And this was the first time I met him. I was 14. And I watched him mix the show, and he took me through the sound department, and I was absolutely amazed. And then, you know, at the interval, we went outside because he smoked, and we had a little chat. And I saw him again when I was at Lipper, and we went to look at round Les Mis, and he was mixing that. And I managed to grab him and say, "You won't remember me, but like 3 years ago, I came to the Opera House and sat with you." And he, you know, probably politely said, "Oh yeah, I remember," but didn't. Years later, I did a couple of corporate jobs with him, and you know, it was just great to see like someone 15 years on. And I remember saying to him, you know, "You're one of the reasons that I got into this industry. You know, like giving me a chance and letting me look around a big show." And so what I'd say is, if you're interested in this stuff, you've got to be pushy. You've got to find out that name and keep ringing and keep emailing. And most of the tours, if you get hold of the right people, will be quite happy to let you come in and sit at the desk for free and sit and watch the show and watch the sound department run the show. And it's even better if you turn up with some biscuits, you know what I mean? And, you know, the sound department absolutely loves sweets and biscuits as a thank you. And that's all it costs to get involved. And it's, you know, invaluable experience.
That's a great answer. Thank you. If you can't get opportunities, make your own.
Absolutely.
Has anyone else got any questions for Chris? I think you've literally answered all the questions in your speech anyway, but in a great way. Anybody else got any questions for Chris? No. Oh, can we give Chris a massive round of applause, please? Thank you. A muted one apart from me.
I can see.
I'm going to stop recording now.